So in this hour of mercy, we reflect on the Lord's invitation for us to imitate Him in one specific area. As it happens, last Saturday I was meditating on a very powerful reading which I'd like to take up again because it's particularly suitable for a moment of reflection like this one. It's the prayer of the young Solomon when he realizes that he has to face, without experience, the governing of a kingdom. So he doesn't ask for riches or victory over his enemies. He asks for what? A discerning spirit, variously translated as an understanding heart, or words to that effect, each language having a bash. The original Hebrew characteristically is very concrete. Lev shomeach. Lev is heart, and the root of shomach is to listen, shemach. It's a soft H. The ayin sound, which you find there at the beginning of the Jewish day and its end, Shemach Israel. Therefore, something which is a key to all our relationship, listening. It works upwards and outwards. So the prayer is, give your servant a heart to understand how to discern between good and evil. Now that's coming through the Jerusalem Bible, which, as you know, is also a paraphrase. Therefore, if you want to do serious Lectio Divina, it's good to have with you something which is also a literal translation, and not to be satisfied with just these very free translations, because it does the work for you. The only thing is, you're not actually reading the Word of God as such, you're reading the paraphrase of the Word of God, so it's as well to be aware of that, and not to just presume that you've got it for the first time in all its density. So the word, a listening heart, is far more powerful actually than the paraphrase. So much so that it has become a book. There is a nun in France who has written a whole book on it. She may no longer be alive, but it was a classic in France in the 80s already. And it went in this direction, just taking that phrase, Seigneur, donne-moi un cœur qui écoute. And on she went for a whole book, what those two concepts were. Le cœur et l'écoute. And the rule of St. Benedict starts off with that very word, ausculta, fili. And in France, the word for a stethoscope is based on that Latin word of auscultare, very intense listening. Now you look at what a doctor's doing with a stethoscope, he's trying to find your heartbeat. So they're very profound ways of listening. And in the beginning of the Rule of St. Benedict, to start off with that word, collocates the whole adventure of the spiritual life in that key, at the receiving end. And the second word of the rule, fili, indicates that one is as a son, a disciple, and the disciple sits at the feet of the master and listens and looks. There was in France, not long before the beatification of now blessed, the one Elisabeth de la Trinité of Dijon, that Carmelite nun who had a great devotion to the indwelling of the Blessed Trinity and actually used her name for the purpose, the Beth, the house of God, Elizabeth, that she was the house of God. And she cultivated a whole spirituality of the indwelling and how it is sufficient to gaze with all one's intense interiority in one direction at the guest, that was contemplation, never lost. She was a tabernacle, no less than any tabernacle in any church on earth, and that was the spirituality that she left to her order. And there was, in the little book that we were given to read about her spirituality, presumably produced by Carmelites, a Carmelite friar and a Carmelite nun. The nun would have done the drawings, and there's one drawing there which says it all. It's this posture of the young Carmelite on one of those Taizé stools there and looking up at the Lord who is sitting. The posture of the teacher is sitting. Hence we have cathedrals. Cathedra is a seat of learning. One has a chair in a university if one is professor, that is, one presides over that faculty. One is teaching with authority, and the bishop classically has the right to sit when he's preaching. And that's how it was done in Cardiff actually by the Archbishop. The Metropolitan Archbishop Wales used to sit there on his cathedra. I was quite moved by that, sitting in authority to all his priests on Holy Thursday. And in fact, strangely enough, actually in Rome, when I was staying there in the Merinal College, they had taken that on board. It is actually in the rubrics. One can actually sit while giving the homily. They had taken that on board, and we always used to sit in community while giving the homily as the teacher for the other brethren for that moment. And actually some things were said in those homilies which remain me to this day. There are moments in community for sharing a truth which can last, a few words in which a truth lasts forever. It's really calm when you're sitting with your brethren. But anyway, this was the element of the, in that case, the whole ethos of the nun, and therefore any soul in a state of receptivity, was that of looking up, gazing at the master who had all to teach, and we had all to receive, all to learn. A good student, a good child, is someone who actually asks lots of questions. And children do ask questions, and they want an answer. And they will receive the first answer, and that's the one that they will tend to count on. Therefore it's important that the first answer or the first truth that they hear is the correct one, and not some correcting system to something which has already been addressed in the past. And unfortunately that's happening too. Now, this element, therefore, of waiting for a word is a whole spirituality. It's a mode of being. It operates upwards, as I say, and also outwards, because the person who is good at one will be good at the other. And people who are by nature very, the word sort of exists in English, but it exists in continental language, expansive, expansif, espansivo in Italian, they're getting out of themselves, they're outside their skin, they're kind of always on the outside of themselves, and they're therefore very kind of bubbly, but in the bad sense, they're not able to be interiorized. Well, it's not necessarily the bad sense, but they're handicapped when it comes to certain things. And therefore, if we are that way inclined, we need to be aware of it, that we can actually be not in a good mode of receptivity if by tendency we tend to, for instance, in conversation, be doing the talking, because that might also be happening in our prayer. And therefore, a contemplative soul, or one of that orientation, is good at both. And it's good also, in general, as we navigate through life, to be aware that that is limiting us. If we are, by tendency, feeling obliged all the time to be doing the conversation, to be leading it, to be feeding it, we can actually be damaging it, and in the process damaging our own input, because we're a barrage to new grace and new truth. We don't have anything to learn. Whereas a person who, in that receptive mode, is empty, is touched by much, and will find a new truth and a new grace in anything, even an event, even a paragraph of a book, and quite often will be fed by only a few words well received. Whereas some people, they go on and on reading or looking at new YouTubes, and they do not relish anymore the power of one word. They are too much saturated with many. So a certain simplicity also comes into it. as in conversation, it does not have to be prolonged. Conversation becomes useless and has lost its use, and becomes damaging and is no longer edifying. Know that the conversation does not have to go on beyond its useful limit. That is part of the problem in our fellowship, that sometimes we go to an official prayer group when in fact it's a talking shop and a little bit of prayer is thrown in, and one is talking a lot to get in a bit of prayer. It happens more than one thinks. The whole evenings go into cups of tea when they should actually be going to the Lord. It's not the same, actually, e.g. the intensity of an hour of adoration with 3 hours of being in someone's house, out of which 2 is going into the tea. And it happens, don't be in any illusion. And also all the dysfunctionality that might go with it, gossip and all that kind of thing, and also the negative dynamics in the air, because unfortunately many a prayer group falls down because of the human dynamics. And it says a lot about the quality of the prayer, therefore. So let's get this straight. If a community prayer, a fellowship of prayer, is in that listening mode, then there's a chance that precisely these things can be addressed. Why? We're waiting for the word from him. We're not actually coming to tell him what to do. We're coming to be ministered to, adoring, praising, gratuitous praise, which does not necessarily have to be noisy. I was quite impressed, as were thousands of other people going in the same direction, when in the early 90s, 1990 I think I was there, we went from Wales, a whole busload of us, to Taizé, and it was actually quite moving how few words were spoken, but how much prayer was going on. I think about 12,000 of us there in that time. I can't remember, certainly 7,000, a huge thing altogether, all over Europe. And basically it was prayer being sustained by very simple means, which is surely a gift from the Spirit, because the advantage of that simple prayer is that the mind is free to fly. One does not have to be creating huge beauty with consciousness. It just kind of happens. And that is the best, often, prayer, because when it's distracted by the prayer itself, in its making I mean, it can actually be taking away from the one we're addressing with our mind. So a certain automatic pilot is a great help. And therefore, however, one needs to be aware that one has to have the initial effort to get onto a mode which works automatically. It's a cop-out to say, therefore we don't do a thing. That's the other extreme. But to create beauty, it's not that difficult. Just a little bit of initial effort and then it's off. And remember, God wants a space in which he can get in. And the advantage of E.G. creating that kind of very simple, sustained atmosphere, which they do through Taizé Charter, which we do here or anywhere where it can be used, is that you're creating a sacred space which actually heals also. Because singing, especially in harmony, is somehow above the banal. It's the best for him. And in that, he is more likely to be able to get through to us and to touch us. And in fact, the advantage of our Catholic prayer, as the Oriental Church, is that it does actually touch us on every level. All the senses are involved. Compare with specifically Protestant prayer, in which only certain senses are involved, this one especially, and the mind. There is a certain physicity and sensuality in the good sense involved, which actually elevates us on every level. We have a joy in being here. That is important. We need a certain otherness. And unfortunately, in Ireland, not many are exposed to it by now on a parish level. There is not all that much elevating beauty, quite frankly, normally in an Irish parish celebration on a Sunday. One reason is that people don't want to be there, so it has to be quick. And it's rather sad, because they're not getting what they have a right to. In other countries, as you probably are aware, having gone over the other countries, they don't have that mentality in the same way. If they've made the effort, they want the full works. Therefore you'll get a certain effort made. But unfortunately in Ireland we're up against it. So the advantage is that the Lord, as we have seen all around Ireland, is putting a burden on little groups' hearts to offer him a space supplementary and complementary to it, groups in which that can happen freely, where people actually want to be. And that can happen especially when they're young. Now, this receptivity, therefore, is nourished by sacred space and a certain sacred attitude. Now, this book came to me, not by chance, from Italy the other day, and it's a translation into English of a, not exactly a volume, but collected writings of somebody who was implementing really something at that time, the 1920s, fairly original. It was, I think, the first real secular institute coming into existence without external habits and so on. And some of the church authorities were trying to force them into a kind of structure well known, but he was resisting. And he had this intuition that there was a call for this type of life as well. People consecrated, but just in the midst. But therefore, what was he doing? In the place of an external structure like a habit, he was giving them an interior one. And he was working on that big time. And he gives a whole spirituality of silence. Because he was trying to indicate that there is, in any situation, a possibility of being in contemplative mode if one has an attitude of sacred silence. It's a silence which involves the interior and the exterior. He starts off with a very high, astounding thought of what silence actually is engaged in. We must try hard, he says, to live as one lives in heaven. But therefore there is this element of anticipation in the life of the soul here on earth, genuinely trying to live in this state of vision, looking upwards, looking into the eyes of, and with the spirituality of Elizabeth of the Trinity, looking inwards at the host of the soul. In heaven, nothing disturbs peace, union, and pure love. Now, therefore, disturbance, disturbare, is something which is an enemy of the soul. Father Michael Marr was here one day, and he was quoting a priest of his community who was long dead. Hell is full of noise. And that is really what it's about, that when we are delighted to be in a noisy atmosphere, we are happy in the company of the emitters thereof, the fallen angels. Dum magnum silentium tenerent omnia. Now that's used on one of the Christmas masses there. When peaceful silence lay over all. That's from Wisdom 18, verse 14. And it comes again towards the end of the Bible in the book of the Apocalypse. There was silence in heaven for half an hour. And it's like the calm before the storm. The birds are quiet and so on. Anticipation. So too, the soul, to receive a word, has to have that element of anticipation, preparing with an emptiness and a hunger. You can't come just like that and crash into the Blessed Trinity and go back as though nothing had happened. You can't come and crash into eternity without putting the brakes on for a while from time. We have to get into mode. Now, in the monastic life, that is actually built in because the bell rings to warn you and you get into procession or whatever the system is in the local monastery before you come in. It's all in such a way that you're not making a crash landing but gliding into the Godhead. And so one is prepared. In the world, one sees people, a lot of people actually, coming into church after the beginning even of Mass itself. So the preparatory work has not happened, basically, and even if they do come early, they're obliged now to talk to somebody in church. So it's all gone by the wayside as regards what is this sacred space, the avant. See, the profanum, fanum in Latin is the temple, the profanum, the profane, is the forecourt of the temple, and therefore that stuff should be happening before you get in there. When the profane gets into the fanum, then it's just chaos, and God can't really get a word in edgeways. And also at the end, it's the same now, because people really are themselves at that point a fanum, a temple. They have the Lord in them. And what are they doing? Again, they're talking about the latest football match in church. So again, it doesn't favour fruitful encounter. And the Lord doesn't like it. I remember in Taizé how there was perfect silence with all these thousands of young people there. You could hear a pin drop where they were praying, before, during and after. How did they do it? Well, they'd be coming in bit by bit, you see, into this huge thing where they're all on the ground, on these kneelers and things. And then you had posted at strategic points all over the place human beings with a large sandwich board, kind of this thing in all the language of creation. They had silentium, stille, and all the rest of it, silence basically, on this sign in front of them. Because a human being was holding it, you see, they would listen. Whereas no one cares two hoots about something which is written on the back of the door, but you get human beings holding it, and it's quite a different. So that's the way it works. If you really want silence in church, there are ways, means of getting it. And also, with regard to the mobile phone, it ruins everything these days, because you can't now preach in any kind of assembly of any sort, and it'll go off unless you actually tell them at the beginning to put it off. And there might be hope, but in Italy you had to do that. You had to, before you celebrated on a Sunday or Saturday evening, you had to find some excuse to get into the ambo, to go over some chant or something, and then you'd say, now switch off your phones. If you didn't do that, it was chaos. And they'll answer them if you're not careful too, in church. So all that is what we're up against. The portion of God, because it doesn't work automatically if we don't do our preparatory work. Grace is frustrated because we are not really taking care of it. Now, as all is silent up there in heaven, where in an eternal generation God conceives and gives birth to the eternal Word, His Son. So God, says St. John of the Cross, says only one word, utters only one word. It is His Word, the Son. And the utterance is the self-understanding of the Eternal Father, the Logos. And we, therefore, need to be in some kind of participation of this truth. The truth is what we need. I remember talking to a student who had just become a Catholic at university, and we were discussing this question of very sincere Christians who are content where they are. And she said this: it is better to be a Catholic because the mind needs the truth. And on both sides, actually we could say the same thing, we knew both sides of the equation. There's an uneasiness in the Protestant position, because say what you like, they won't say it themselves, but when you've been there you know that's what's going on in the back of your mind. It's actually not a happy position to be in, because basically it's a position of denial, it's a position of protest, it's a position of accusation. It's not the best starting point, because you know that you've come from somewhere, and therefore that you're saying to that somewhere you're wrong. See, what you're getting at is the whole feeling is not really a peaceful one. It's a question of having something to say all the time, having to address something all the time. And it's a whole thing, whatever you say about it, they're always against Rome, you see. Whereas a Catholic hasn't got that dis-ease. He can approach any Protestant calmly and listen to what he's saying, and without losing his peace, he knows what the answer is, because he's got the whole of 2 millennia behind him, and also common sense. Therefore, that was what she was saying. The mind needs to be satisfied, and you cannot be satisfied with incompleteness. There is a hole in the Catholic theology which calmly, like a bulldozer, comes through the century and knows what it is and what it owns, because it's not its own master. It is a participation in the one word of the Eternal Father, the Logos. Therefore, there can only be one truth. And therefore, the very fact of being part of something which is so fragmentary, thousands and thousands of protests, all different, is bound to put you in a situation of not being at ease in your psychological and mental plane. We need enough for our higher thinking. It cannot be got. The Eastern Church is in a better position, and yet there's bound to be the feeling that Peter is missing. We won't go into that now, but they have the sacraments. They also have something which, by the way, is why partly they engage with difficulty with us in our theological overtures to them, because they're aware that whatever about the history of the Catholic Church right now, in the West, they're pandering to Protestantism and worse. So there you see rightly not at ease about what's going on in the West, because they know where they've come from and they do not change it. And it's not ours to change. The truth is not something that we tamper with. And also the heritage, the baggage, the culture, the beauty, all that we have received from the saints of 2,000 years is not ours to throw over our shoulder just like that. Therefore, they are on that level closer to something that we need to respect, not just to think that we're superior, because spiritually they may be way ahead of us. Remember, in the East, all their bishops are in practice monks. Have to be, because they're taken from the celibate clergy. And therefore, the tops, those therefore who give the teaching, are men of prayer, formed in severe fasting, hours of long liturgical prayer, the Jesus prayer. That, you see, is something to be respected. Whereas we have, in the West, huge numbers of holy priests and bishops, but also huge numbers of great administrators. Things function very well in the West. But one asks sometimes, where is the Holy Spirit? All that to say that therefore listening works on that level too. We listen to what the Spirit is saying to all the saints and all the friends of God over the planet. Each one has his message. And a proud person is self-sufficient and has no more to learn. Proof, you have an answer for everything. He'll interrupt before the person is finished. For this reason, he says, silence will be your first rule in whatever condition you are. You must form your habitual, loved, and lovable atmosphere, the almost presupposed condition to the building of your spiritual structure. Therefore, fundamentally, this is the habit that he was creating for these sisters. A spirituality and an ethos of gentleness and perpetual orientation towards that kind of praise. And he actually extends it physically to the external. Silence, above all external silence, in our limbs and in the tools or objects we use. In walking, which must be like that of a king's daughter, of an angel of heaven. Be the opening and closing of doors and windows as the rising and the setting of the sun, or the blooming of a gem, or like an inspiration when it rises within you. In using any tool or doing any work, avoid noise and observe silence as far as possible, just as God governs the world in the greatest peace. Then he goes on some practical hints. Talk only when and where it is right to talk, and do so in a dignified way, never loudly, approaching the person if he is far away. Now, this element of noisiness is something which ought to be looked at. Why do we have to say things loudly when a person is right next to us? Why do we have to, for instance, say things loudly on the phone when the person is right next to you on the other end of the phone? Why even do we have to use our body all the time when speaking? Sometimes a word with great interiority is far more forceful than a loud one. And sometimes actually a little giggle is far more powerful than a huge guffaw, a huge noise, explosion of laughter. There's a certain dignity even in the joviality of a person, and it's something that one cultivates actually in the monastic life. If you go to, e.g., a Benedictine cloister where there might be recreation now and again, not the cloister itself, but in some room, that you'll find that coming into place, that they would avoid that element of raucous undignified kind of Guinness laughter. It would be something a bit elevated, and it's something which makes a difference, because then there's no discontinuity. The whole house is bathed with angelic presence, and that is the feel that one should get in any good community. And it does actually happen, and also on the level of the extension of that to others around us, that courteousness extended to the living tabernacle, which is the brother. I remember hearing a very good conference by the Abbot General of the Olivetans one time. They had a monastery, their main house was next to us, nearly in Italy, and Monte Oliveto had this Abbot General, and he gave one conference before Compline in church one night on courtesy. And he picked all the passages in Benedict on courtesy, and he showed quietly and calmly, with this calm talk, how it is an essential part of the way that we honour God and each other. Courteousness. If one says anything at all, one does so with the right word, the tender word, the polite word. It extends actually even to not using e.g. David to each other in the monastic life. It has to be brother David and so on. These things, he was insisting, they're part of the ethos. It's the otherness. It's not the matiness. And in the same way, the way that we handle a person, this kind of matiness, whereas there are ways and means of expressing in our gestuality a certain respect, in which there is also a passing of warmth, is something which can be cultivated. A certain dignity in our bearing, therefore, words, gestures, and general comportment. All an atmosphere of sacred silence under the modality of the moment, which one needs to cultivate. One doesn't switch on and off, because we are always inhabited by the Blessed Trinity. Back to Elizabeth and the Blessed Trinity, that we are actually all the time like the tabernacle itself. Silence in your whole bearing too. Everything should always be dignified, calm, I would say noble, as behoves the sons of God. Our brothers, by approaching or looking at you, must experience what you are living and innerly rejoice in the peace and the joy of God. So, with that, we can leave him, because the joy is the actual fruit of it. Because there is this element, therefore, of if we are inhabited, we are in a state of virtual joy. We have the source of it in us. And therefore, if we go around like death warmed up, one asks why. I mean, wherever we are, we should, with simple means, be creating only healing. And the immediate litmus test, really, of a good or bad community is their joy and warmth. I remember actually some years ago listening to the person, it was one of the monks there, he was from one of the English monasteries, and he was going around all the monasteries of the British Isles with the Benedictine yearbook. It comes out every year, all the facts and figures and so on, and all you need to know for the year in each monastery. And he'd come to the monastery where I was at the time, and he came out with this in the calefactory. He picked this up. I forget which one it was, no, one of the monasteries, one of the English Benedictine monasteries, and they'd put into their blurb this: it has been said of us that there is no charity in our community. And he said, you see, this remark, this was put in by a community which was strong enough to be able to put it in. In other words, there was a lot of charity in that community, because they had a sense of humour. And that is actually an attraction also to young men. And quite a few monasteries will attract if they, as the first impetus, give joy and warmth. I remember hearing this, or reading it actually, about a big monastery that the Norbertines have in California. They were interviewing young people and so on, I think after they'd got in, after they'd entered, and this kind of thing was coming out. Why did you enter this one? I entered this community because I saw they had joy and I wanted it. So that's far better than a whole load of programming, high-powered YouTubes, and when you get there, you're deluded. It applies also to us. Christianity is caught, not taught. Remember that old saying, your actions speak so loudly that I can't hear what your words are saying. Often that element of just somehow letting people understand that the Lord is with us and that He is joy is the best we can do as regards evangelization. The rest, after all, is His problem. If we get in the way, we're more of a hindrance than